In life, you might forgive someone for accidentally spilling coffee on your shirt, but destroying your water pipeline that keeps you alive, that's where I draw the line. And when the perpetrator turns out to be the HOA queen herself, Celeste Monroe, well, you know, this isn't just a battle. This is premium satirical theater. I'm Harrison Clark, a guy who specializes in pipeline work, and I turned a pile of rubble into the coldest, most legally sound revenge that woman ever tasted. Get ready to watch, because this isn't just a story about water. This is a battle of wits where justice gets watered by the tears of my enemies. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. This story is about to get wild. That Tuesday morning in June started peacefully enough in my quiet suburban neighborhood, where I'd been living for 3 years as a 32-year-old pipeline specialist who believed in doing everything by the book. I just finished installing what I thought was a perfectly legal water line from my private well to my garden irrigation system, complete with all the proper permits, past inspections, and every bureaucratic requirement met to the letter. My well had been legally registered for years, and my garden was the envy of the neighborhood. A lush, green oasis that stood out against the backdrop of browning lawns and wilting flower beds that were the unfortunate result of increasingly strict water restrictions. While everyone else's properties were slowly turning into miniature deserts, mine looked like something straight out of a gardening magazine, and apparently that made me a target. The thing about our neighborhood is that it's controlled by this organization called a homeowners association. And if you've never had the misfortune of dealing with one of these little kingdoms, consider yourself blessed. They're supposed to maintain property values and keep things presentable. But sometimes they transform into petty dictatorships, where small-minded tyrants get to play God with their neighbors' daily lives. Our particular dictator was a woman named Celeste Monroe, 35 years old, with the kind of smile that could freeze hell over, and a personality that made Arctic ice seem warm by comparison. She'd moved here from managing some high-end developments downtown, and had immediately appointed herself the neighborhood's supreme ruler, complete with an attitude that suggested she owned every blade of grass and every living soul within a 5 m radius. I was out checking my irrigation system around 7:00 in the morning, when the peaceful silence was shattered by the roar of heavy machinery coming down my usually quiet street. That's when I saw them approaching like a mechanized army, a crew of workers operating a massive excavator, heading straight for my property with purposeful determination. Behind them, marching with the confidence of a general leading troops into battle, was Celeste Monroe herself, clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured hands, and wearing that particular expression she got when she was about to make someone's life absolutely miserable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, running toward what was clearly about to become a scene of destruction. Celeste turned to face me, with that smugly satisfied look she'd perfected over years of terrorizing her neighbors. "You're wasting community resources. Harrison Clark," she declared, waving her clipboard like some kind of royal decree. "This pipeline violates our aesthetic standards and our community water usage regulations." I stood there in complete disbelief, watching as thousands of dollars of carefully planned infrastructure was about to be turned into expensive confetti. All because this woman had decided that my success was somehow a personal threat to her authority. The workers followed her orders with mechanical efficiency, and the sound was absolutely horrifying. The sharp crack of breaking plastic pipes, the metallic screech of destroyed fittings, and the wet splash of pressurized water exploding in all directions as my carefully engineered distribution network was systematically demolished. Water sprayed everywhere like a broken fire hydrant, soaking the workers, flooding my flower beds, and turning the carefully maintained soil into a muddy swamp. Pieces of shattered pipe flew through the air. Chunks of concrete and metal fittings scattered across my lawn like shrapnel. and my beautiful irrigation system was being reduced to a chaotic pile of broken plastic and twisted metal in a matter of minutes. What struck me most was Celeste's reaction to the destruction, or rather, her complete lack of any human reaction whatsoever. She stood there watching with detached interest, showing no concern for the thousands of dollars in damage being inflicted, no sympathy for the months of work being destroyed, and certainly no recognition that what she was ordering might actually be illegal destruction of private property. Her face remained perfectly composed, almost serene, as if watching someone's dreams get literally torn apart was just another item on her daily to-do list. That expression, more than anything else, told me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Someone who derived genuine satisfaction from exercising power over others, regardless of the cost or consequences. As I was processing this destruction, I noticed one of my neighbors, an elderly woman who usually waved cheerfully from her kitchen window, quickly closing her curtains and stepping back from view, clearly afraid that being seen sympathizing with me might make her the next target for Celeste's wrath. The message was clear. Challenge Celeste's authority, and you'll face the consequences alone. When the destruction was finally complete, and my irrigation system looked like a war zone, Celeste walked over with that victorious smile and handed me an official-looking document. Violation notice. It read in bold letters, followed by a list of infractions that would make a career criminal blush, and a fine that was basically legalized extortion. The amount was so ridiculously excessive that I actually laughed out loud, which seemed to irritate her, because she'd clearly expected me to grovel for mercy. Here's the thing about moments like these. You have exactly two choices. You can either explode into righteous fury, like most people would do, which is exactly what Celeste was expecting. Or you can stay completely calm and start planning something much more satisfying than a momentary emotional outburst. I chose option 2, even though every fiber of my being wanted to grab that clipboard and demonstrate exactly where she could file her violation notice. Instead of giving her the dramatic reaction she was anticipating, I pulled out my phone and started methodically recording everything. "You'll learn to live like the rest of us. Harrison Clark," she said in that condescending tone, clearly expecting me to crumble under her administrative terrorism. But I just looked her straight in the eye, smiled that cold, calculating smile I'd been saving for special occasions, and said something that caught her off guard. "Thank you for reminding me about regulations, Mrs. Monroe. I'll be sure to remember everything you've taught me about following the rules to the absolute letter." The confusion that flickered across her face was priceless, like she couldn't figure out why I wasn't reacting like her previous victims. She recovered quickly, laughed like she'd heard the funniest joke in the world, and walked away with her demolition crew, leaving me standing in the ruins with nothing but a massive fine and a phone full of video evidence that would prove far more valuable than she could possibly imagine. After the pipeline destruction, my life became a relentless barrage of violation notices from the HOA, arriving with the regularity of junk mail and about as welcome as a tax audit. It was like Celeste had made harassing me her full-time job, dedicating herself to finding something wrong with every aspect of my property. The violation notices came with creative variety that would have been impressive if it weren't so obviously vindictive. My front door was non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetic standards, despite being the same color for 3 years. My flower choices were suddenly not on the approved vegetation list, even though half the neighborhood had identical plantings. And even my air conditioning unit was somehow disturbing the peace, according to regulations that seemed invented specifically for my benefit. Each notice came with helpful suggestions to use trusted contractors recommended by the HOA, and every recommendation led back to the same company, Green Oasis Landscaping, owned by Wallace Thompson. Though everyone called him Wall-E, seemed to be the magical solution to every problem Celeste could manufacture. Need your lawn brought into compliance with mysterious new standards? Call Wally for only 3 times what any other company would charge. Want to avoid getting fined for having the wrong mulch? Wall Ally was your guy, with prices that would make luxury car dealers blush. The whole setup was so transparently corrupt. It would have been comedy gold if it weren't costing residents thousands in unnecessary work and inflated prices. Wall Ally himself was exactly what you'd expect. All fake smiles and overly firm handshakes with slick charm that made used car salesmen look trustworthy. His business was thriving because every homeowner wanting to avoid Celeste's wrath ended up hiring him for everything from basic maintenance to complete overhauls nobody needed. He turned HOA terror into profit. And from my careful observation, he and Celeste had worked out a beautifully coordinated arrangement where she created expensive problems, and he provided even more expensive solutions. One afternoon, while trying to salvage my garden with a basic sprinkler system that barely kept my plants alive, I caught one of Wally's employees making my life worse. The guy's name was Chadwick Jenkins. Everyone called him Chad, and he looked like he'd stepped out of a gym advertisement, all bulging muscles and attitude with a brain sharp as a butter knife. I found him deliberately dumping yard waste and dead branches onto my property, creating violations that would result in more fines and more recommendations to hire Green Oasis for cleanup. The scene was so blatantly obvious it was almost insulting. Chad was literally scattering debris while wearing a Green Oasis uniform, like he wanted me to know exactly who was behind this harassment. When I confronted him, Chad stopped and turned with the kind of smirk that suggested he was completely untouchable. "Yard maintenance is a privilege, not a right, buddy," he said, delivering a clearly rehearsed line. "Around here, Mrs. Monroe decides who gets to have nice things and who doesn't. And from what I hear, you're definitely in the second category." As he spoke, he continued spreading debris, including some particularly nasty organic matter that would attract insects. But in his arrogance, Chad made a crucial mistake. As he bent over to dump another load, a business card fell from his shirt pocket and landed at my feet. I picked it up and saw it wasn't just a Green Oasis card, but one with Celeste Monroe's personal cell phone number written on the back in her distinctive handwriting, along with a note reading special rate for priority enforcement. The whole situation was infuriating but educational. Every harassment tactic, every bogus violation, every coincidental mess was giving me a clearer picture of how Celeste's empire functioned. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running a sophisticated protection racket where residents either paid tribute to her preferred contractors or faced endless harassment until they moved away or fell in line. The beauty of the operation was that everything looked legal on paper. HOAs do have legitimate authority to enforce reasonable rules and issue appropriate fines. Instead of fighting back with angry complaints that would give her more ammunition, I decided to do what I do best: research. I spent evenings digging through public records, old HOA documents, city planning maps, and anything else that might give insight into how our neighborhood's water and land rights actually worked. Most documentation was standard bureaucratic stuff: subdivision regulations, utility easements, environmental studies, the usual paperwork mountain. But then, I found something that caught my attention. An old survey map from the 1980s showing several private wells throughout our area, along with interesting notations about unused water extraction rights from a company called Aquaors Corporation that had gone out of business in the late 80s. While knee-deep in research, I had an unexpected encounter that proved crucial. Walking back from my mailbox one evening, still fuming about the latest violation notice, I bumped into Robert Miller, a 52-year-old retired attorney living 3 houses down. Rob was one of those quiet, observant types, but he'd been watching Celeste's systematic targeting of me with growing concern. "I've been noticing what's happening to you," he said without pleasantries, cutting to the heart like a good lawyer. "That woman's been pushing people around too long. And there's something seriously wrong with how she handles HOA finances and contractor relationships." Rob turned out to be exactly the ally I needed. As a former attorney with decades of experience dealing with authority abuse, he understood how to work within the system for real results. As a longtime resident, quietly observing Celeste's reign, he'd been keeping detailed records of her questionable decisions and suspicious financial arrangements. He'd noticed the pattern of violations followed by expensive contractor recommendations and had been documenting everything in case someone challenged the HOA's corrupt practices. When I showed him what I discovered about AquaOrs and the abandoned water rights, his eyes lit up with the excitement that comes from finding the perfect piece of evidence in a complex legal puzzle. "This is it," he said, studying the documents with focused intensity. "This is exactly what we need to turn the tables and restore sanity to this community." Rob explained he'd wondered about the legal basis for our neighborhood's water supply, since monthly bills seemed surprisingly low for the amount being used. He'd suspected some special arrangement or grandfathered rights that most residents didn't know about. The fact that AquaOrs had held comprehensive extraction rights to local groundwater, and those rights had never been properly transferred after bankruptcy, meant there was a genuine legal opportunity to challenge the entire foundation of Celeste's power structure in a way she'd never see coming. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually have a path to victory that didn't involve just enduring her abuse indefinitely. The next few weeks felt like planning an elaborate heist. Except instead of stealing money, Rob and I were working to legally acquire something far more valuable: control over the fundamental resource that made life in our neighborhood possible. The process of claiming abandoned water rights was incredibly complex and bureaucratic, involving trips to multiple government offices designed to discourage anyone without serious determination. There were filing fees that made my wallet cry, background checks requiring documentation back to childhood, and enough paperwork to deforest a small country. But with Rob's legal expertise guiding me through every step, we slowly began transferring ownership of AquaOrs Corporation's defunct water rights to me. The legal system moves like a glacier during an ice age, so while waiting for approvals, I had to continue enduring Celeste's escalating harassment campaign. She had apparently decided my continued existence was a personal insult, requiring increasingly sophisticated punishment. Violation notices arrived almost daily, each more ridiculous than the last, like she was running out of legitimate complaints and making them up from spite. My lawn was inconsistent with community aesthetic standards because it wasn't green enough, despite water restrictions making perfect lawns nearly impossible. My mailbox was improperly positioned, though it hadn't moved a millimeter since installation 3 years ago. The breaking point came with a violation notice, stating I was required to hire a certified landscape professional to bring my property into compliance with newly established standards that hadn't existed the previous week. The notice included approved contractors with green oasis, featured prominently with a glowing recommendation reading like paid advertisement. The estimated cost was equivalent to a decent used car, and the proposed work seemed designed more to empty my bank account than actually improve my property. One Tuesday morning, while Rob and I were at the county courthouse filing water rights documents, we had a close call that almost derailed our entire plan. I was at the filing window handing over paperwork when I heard a familiar voice that made my blood run cold. "I need to file these violation enforcement documents immediately," Celeste announced to another clerk, using that imperious tone she employed when wanting everyone to know her importance. I quickly ducked behind a support column, frantically signaling Rob to do the same, while Celeste conducted business 20 ft away. For several terrifying minutes, we tried looking invisible while she processed what appeared to be legal papers related to forcing compliance with her latest regulations. If she'd turned and seen us with water rights documents, she would have immediately figured out our plan, exposing our entire strategy before we could implement it. Fortunately, Celeste was too focused on her paperwork and too confident in her absolute authority to pay attention to who else might be conducting courthouse business. She left without noticing our presence. But the close call reminded us how important it was to keep our activities completely secret until we were ready to reveal our hand at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. 3 weeks after starting the legal process, Rob called with news that made my heart race. "It's official," he said, satisfaction and amazement clear in his voice. "You are now the legal owner of Aqua Ors Corporation's water extraction rights for the entire neighborhood underground aquifer system. Congratulations, Harry. You just became the most powerful person in your HOA without anyone having the slightest idea what happened." I sat in my kitchen, staring at official documents that had arrived in morning mail, trying to process what this meant for me and everyone else in our community. Every drop of water flowing through every pipe in every house was now subject to my legal control because I owned exclusive rights to the underground source, making it all possible. The beautiful irony was almost poetic. Nobody at the HOA had any idea what had transpired while they were busy harassing me with violation notices. They had been operating under the assumption that water access was permanent and unquestionable, probably because the system had worked fine for decades, and nobody had investigated the legal details of where that water came from or who had ultimate authority to control its distribution. The moment I truly understood my new power came standing in my backyard, looking at the simple valve connecting the neighborhood's water system to the underground source I now legally controlled. It was just a basic shut-off valve, the kind I'd installed hundreds of times in my pipeline career. But now, it represented something much more significant than plumbing equipment. That valve was the physical manifestation of my ability to grant or deny the most essential resource for human survival to every person who had participated in or remained silent during my systematic harassment. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had real power, instead of just being a victim of someone else's arbitrary authority. While savoring this delicious irony and planning my next moves, I had another encounter that would prove crucial. Mary Gardner, a 42-year-old community event organizer living across the street, knocked on my door one evening with a concerned expression and a plate of homemade cookies. Mary was one of those genuinely good people who actually cared about making the neighborhood better for everyone, and she'd been watching Celeste's increasingly erratic behavior with growing alarm. "I've seen how she's been treating you," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she'd made an important decision. "It's not right, and it's not what this community should be about. If you're planning to fight back somehow, I want to help however I can." Having Mary on my side was like gaining access to the neighborhood's social network, since she knew practically everyone and had insights into how residents really felt about Celeste's reign of terror. As we talked over coffee, Mary revealed she'd been keeping records of HOA abuses, including how Celeste had systematically destroyed community events, bringing residents together. "She canceled our annual spring festival last year," Mary explained with obvious frustration, claiming it violated some insurance regulation nobody had heard of. But I found out later, she was afraid the festival would give residents too many opportunities to talk and potentially organize opposition. "She's been deliberately isolating people so they can't band together against her authority." The final piece of my plan came together when I received another threatening email from Celeste, announcing mandatory increases in HOA water fees, along with stern warnings about resource conservation and community responsibility that sounded more like propaganda than legitimate community management. Her message was full of high-minded language about shared sacrifice and environmental stewardship. But the real message was clear. She was tightening control further and making everyone pay more for the privilege of living under her increasingly oppressive thumb. "Water belongs to the community," she wrote, "and no individual has the right to hoard or waste this precious resource." I read that line several times, each reading making it more ironic considering the water she was talking about now legally belonged entirely to me, thanks to rights she didn't even know existed. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed, because tomorrow I was going to introduce Celeste Monroe to a concept that had apparently never occurred to her. Consequences. The HOA's monthly meeting was held in the community center, a building that Celeste had basically transformed into her personal throne room over the past few years of increasingly authoritarian rule. She'd arranged the space so that she sat at a raised table at the front while everyone else was relegated to uncomfortable folding chairs arranged in neat rows, like subjects awaiting judgment from their queen. Tonight's meeting was supposed to be particularly important because she was planning to officially ratify the new water usage fees and restrictions that she'd been threatening everyone with for weeks. Essentially, making her increased control over the neighborhood's most essential resource completely official and legally binding through what she liked to call democratic process. I arrived carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the kind of calm, confident expression that should have been a warning sign to anyone who knew me well enough to read the signals. Rob and Mary were already there, positioned strategically around the room to provide support when things inevitably got interesting. The rest of the community had turned out in larger numbers than usual, probably because everyone was feeling the increasing pressure of Celeste's recent crackdown and wanted to see what new restrictions and financial burdens she was planning to impose on their daily lives. Celeste herself was dressed like she was heading to a corporate boardroom rather than a neighborhood meeting, clearly intending to make this gathering feel as official and intimidating as possible, while she consolidated her power even further. She started the meeting with her usual performance about community standards and shared responsibility, speaking in that perfectly practiced condescending tone that made even simple announcements sound like lectures from a disappointed parent dealing with particularly slow children. The gist was predictable: new restrictions on everything from lawn watering to car washing to filling kiddie pools, all presented as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of everyone in the community. Her eyes kept drifting to me with that familiar look of superiority, like she was delivering a personal message about who really ran this neighborhood and who was expected to fall in line. When she got to the increased water fees, Celeste really hit her stride with the kind of performance that would have impressed professional politicians, presenting the substantial monthly charges as completely non-negotiable requirements that everyone would accept, whether they liked it or not. "Some people seem to think they can live by different rules than the rest of us," she said, making sure everyone in the room knew she was talking specifically about me and my refusal to submit to her authority. "But water is a community resource that belongs to all of us equally, and everyone needs to contribute their fair share to maintain our infrastructure and ensure proper conservation." The audience was getting visibly restless as the financial implications sank in. You could hear people shifting uncomfortably in their chairs and whispering to each other about how they were going to afford these new fees on top of all their existing expenses. A few people were already pulling out their phones, probably calculating what these increases would do to their monthly budgets. That's when I decided it was time to make my move and introduce some reality into Celeste's carefully orchestrated fantasy. I stood up slowly, still holding my folder of legal documents, and waited patiently for the room to quiet down and focus their attention on what I was about to say. Celeste looked at me with that familiar mixture of annoyance and anticipation, probably expecting me to make some kind of desperate plea for mercy or launch into an angry rant that would give her a perfect excuse to have me removed from the meeting and further demonstrate her authority to everyone present. Instead, I smiled politely and said something that I knew would change everything. Mrs. Monroe, before we vote on these new fees and restrictions, I think the community should know that, as of last week, I am the legal owner of the water extraction rights for the underground aquifer that supplies this entire neighborhood with every drop of water you use. You could have heard a pin drop in that room as the implications of what I just announced slowly sank into everyone's consciousness. The silence was so complete and profound that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background, and people shocked breathing as they tried to process what they just heard and figure out what it meant for their daily lives. Celeste's confident expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered her composure and tried to dismiss what I'd said as some kind of desperate bluff or legal nonsense. "That's absolutely ridiculous," she laughed. But there was a nervous edge creeping into her voice that hadn't been there before, and I could see uncertainty starting to crack her usual facade of absolute confidence. "You can't just own water, Harrison. That's not how any of this works in the real world." The sound of her pen hitting the floor echoed through the silent room as her hands started trembling slightly, a small but telling sign that her supreme confidence was beginning to crumble. Somewhere in the back, an elderly man stood up abruptly, his metal chair scraping loudly against the floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "What the hell does that mean for us?" someone called out from the middle of the room. And suddenly, the quiet erupted into confused chatter as neighbors turned to each other with bewildered expressions and growing panic. I opened my folder with deliberate care and pulled out the official documents that proved exactly how it worked in the real world. Holding them up so everyone in the room could see the government seals and legal stamps that made them legitimate and binding. "Actually, Mrs. Monroe, it turns out you absolutely can own water rights. And I do. Aqua Ors Corporation held the legal extraction rights to the groundwater beneath this neighborhood from 1984 until they went bankrupt in 1987. Last week, I purchased those rights from their bankruptcy estate through proper legal channels. Every drop of water flowing through every pipe in this neighborhood is now subject to my legal control and approval." The room exploded into chaos as people tried to understand what this meant for their ability to shower, wash dishes, and maintain basic human dignity. A woman near the front jumped up so quickly that she knocked over her purse, spilling its contents across the floor, and shouted, "What does that mean for the rest of us? Are you going to cut us off?" I could see Celeste's face getting paler by the second as the full implications of what I just announced started to penetrate her consciousness and threaten everything she'd spent years building. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she was starting to look genuinely sick as she realized the foundation of her power structure was crumbling beneath her feet. It means I continued looking directly at her with the kind of calm satisfaction that comes from holding all the cards in a game where your opponent thought they were cheating. That effective immediately, I will be discontinuing water service to the HOA's distribution system. Every connection from my aquifer to your community infrastructure will be shut off within exactly 48 hours from this moment. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear individual people's sharp intakes of breath and the sound of someone's water bottle hitting the floor and rolling across the room. Then, chaos erupted again, chairs squeaking as people turned to their neighbors in panic, voices rising in confusion and fear, and the unmistakable sound of genuine community-wide crisis beginning to set in. Celeste tried desperately to recover and reassert her authority. Standing up behind her table and attempting to project the same commanding presence she'd always used to control these meetings. But for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely rattled and uncertain about her next move. "You can't do that," she sputtered, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was starting to panic behind her facade of outrage and indignation. "You can't just cut off water to an entire neighborhood. That's illegal. That's blackmail. That's extortion. But Rob had prepared me for exactly this reaction, and I had my response ready and waiting for her desperate attempts to regain control. Actually, Mrs. Monroe, it's completely legal and perfectly within my rights. I own the water rights, which means I have the legal authority to decide how that water is used and who gets access to it. I'm not blackmailing anyone. I'm simply exercising my property rights in exactly the same way you exercised your authority when you destroyed my irrigation system and violated my property rights. The meeting completely devolved into chaos as residents started asking panicked questions, demanding explanations, and generally freaking out about what this meant for basic necessities like cooking, cleaning, and personal hygiene. Some people were angry at me for creating this crisis. Others were angry at Celeste for apparently not knowing that someone else could legally own their water supply. And everyone was confused about how something like this could even be possible in modern America. As the meeting broke up, with nothing resolved, and everyone talking at once in various states of panic and confusion, I made my way toward the door, stopping only to address Celeste one final time. I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I walked away. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was no authority left in that stare, just fear and humiliation where supreme confidence used to live. The woman who had terrorized this community for years now looked small and powerless, like a deflated balloon that had lost all its air. You taught me a lot about following regulations and respecting property rights, Mrs. Monroe, I said with that same polite smile I'd been wearing all evening. I'm just putting those valuable lessons into practice. Tomorrow, I was going to walk out to that main valve and shut it off with my own hands. And there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop me. The next morning dawned bright and clear. And I did exactly what I'd promised, because keeping your word matters even when dealing with people who've never learned that basic lesson. I walked out to the main connection valve where my newly acquired water rights tied into the HOA's distribution system. And I shut it off with the deliberate care of someone performing a significant but necessary task. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning, and I took my time with the process to make sure any neighbors watching understood. This wasn't an accident or maintenance issue. This was deliberate action with deliberate consequences. And I wanted everyone to see I was completely calm and legally justified. The valve turned easily, and within minutes, I could hear the water pressure throughout the neighborhood beginning to drop as the supply everyone had taken for granted simply stopped flowing. By afternoon, phones were ringing constantly at the HOA office, and by evening, Celeste had called an emergency meeting to deal with what she was dramatically calling a crisis situation. But instead of taking responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to this moment, she decided to go on the offensive and paint me as some kind of villain holding the community hostage. Her strategy was transparent: convince everyone that I was the real problem, that I'd orchestrated this situation to extort money from my neighbors, and that the only solution was to unite against me and force me to restore water service on her terms. The emergency meeting was packed with angry, worried residents who wanted answers and solutions. Celeste had spent the day preparing because she came armed with a presentation, painting me as a calculating mastermind who had deliberately created a water shortage for revenge. Harrison Clark has been planning this attack for months, she announced with dramatic flair, projecting confidence despite the cracks showing in her usual composure. He intentionally got himself into conflict with the HOA so he could justify this outrageous action. He's holding our children, our elderly residents, our entire community hostage to satisfy his personal grudges. The scary thing was that her strategy was working. People were frightened and looking for someone to blame, and I was an easier target than complex legal issues. Some residents who'd never paid attention to HOA politics were looking at me like I was a monster who would cut off water to families just to make a point. A single mother near the front stood up with tears in her eyes, and her voice breaking. "My kids can't take baths because of you. How can you do this to innocent people who never hurt you? What kind of person punishes children for adult problems?" The raw emotion in her voice hit me harder than I'd expected, because these weren't the people who'd harassed me. These were just regular families trying to live their lives. For a moment, I actually started to doubt myself. Maybe there was a better way to handle this. Maybe I was taking things too far and hurting people who didn't deserve it. The doubt was eating at me as I listened to neighbors describing how my actions were affecting their daily lives. But then, an older man near the back suddenly stood up, his face red with anger, and started pushing through the crowd toward me. "You selfish bastard," he shouted, reaching out to grab my shirt. "Turn the damn water back on right now." His fingers had just touched my collar when a firm hand caught his wrist. "That's enough," Rob Miller said, stepping between us with the kind of authority that comes from decades of legal experience. The angry man tried to pull away, but Rob's grip was steady, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Before we lynch anyone here, I think we need to take a closer look at how we actually got into this mess. And I think we need to see the HOA's financial records. All of them." The room went quiet again. But this time, the energy was different. Instead of focused anger at me, there was growing uncertainty about what Rob was implying. Celesta tried to deflect Rob's request, claiming financial records weren't relevant to the current crisis and that restoring water service should be the priority. But Rob wasn't backing down, and his calm, methodical approach was making people think instead of just react emotionally. "Actually, Mrs. Monroe, I think the financial records are extremely relevant. See, I've been doing research into HOA expenditures and contractor relationships, and I think the community deserves to know how their money has been spent and why we're facing these massive fee increases." Right around the same time, certain landscaping companies have been getting very lucrative contracts. The mood was shifting from angry mob to concerned community as people started remembering other questionable decisions they had noticed but hadn't connected. Someone called out, "Yeah, why did my landscaping violation notice recommend Green Oasis specifically?" And someone else added, "And why are their prices so much higher than other companies?" Mary Gardner, who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting, stood up and added her voice to Rob's call for transparency. "I've been documenting some very concerning patterns in HOA enforcement and contractor recommendations," she said, pulling out her own folder. "Before we decide who's the villain, we should look at all the evidence." The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, the energy had shifted from a lynch mob, ready to blame me for everything, to concerned neighbors asking the right questions about how their community had been governed. Someone in the back shouted, "Show us the book, Celeste," and others began chanting agreement. The woman who'd been crying about her children not being able to bathe was now looking at Celeste with suspicion instead of at me with hatred. Rob raised his hand for quiet, and when the room settled, he delivered what sounded like a closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we hang anyone, we need to figure out who the real thief is. And thieves don't usually volunteer to show you their ledgers." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Celeste's confidence cracking as she realized her attempt to scapegoat me was backfiring spectacularly. As the meeting broke up with demands for transparency and accountability, I realized my water shut-off had accomplished something unexpected. It had forced the community to examine how they were being governed and whether their leaders were serving their interests or someone else's. The water was still off, and people were still upset about that. But now at least, some of that anger was being directed at the right targets. Tomorrow, we were going to have another meeting, and this time, we were going to get some real answers about how this HOA had been operating and where all that money had been going. The next evening's meeting was completely different from any HOA gathering I'd ever attended in my years of living in this neighborhood. Instead of Celeste running the show from her elevated table like some kind of suburban dictator holding court, Rob Miller had taken charge of the proceedings with the methodical thoroughness and attention to detail that comes from spending decades in courtrooms dealing with complex legal issues and difficult people. Mary Gardner had spent the entire day reaching out to residents throughout the community and collecting documentation of questionable HOA practices. And what she discovered was even worse than I'd suspected during my months of harassment and intimidation. Together, they'd assembled a comprehensive presentation that was going to expose the full extent of Celeste's corruption, and finally, give the community the transparency and accountability they deserved, but had never been allowed to see. Rob started with the financial records that Celeste had been so reluctant to share with the community she was supposed to serve. It turned out that the HOA's books were a masterpiece of creative accounting and questionable expenditures, with expenses that didn't make sense to anyone with basic math skills. Contractor payments that seemed inflated beyond any reasonable explanation, and a clear pattern of emergency repairs and maintenance projects that always seemed to benefit the same small group of companies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rob announced to the packed room with the kind of calm authority that made everyone listen carefully. "Your HOA has been paying Green Oasis Landscaping approximately 3 times the going market rate for basic maintenance work that any competent contractor could perform. And these contracts have been approved without competitive bidding, community input, or any kind of oversight that would protect your financial interests." The numbers he presented were absolutely staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars in overpayments and questionable expenses that had been coming directly out of residents' HOA fees and special assessments. Mary took over from there, and what she revealed was even more damaging to Celeste's reputation and credibility than the financial irregularities. She'd compiled video evidence, witness statements, and detailed documentation showing a clear pattern of selective enforcement and retaliatory violations that had nothing to do with maintaining community standards, and everything to do with punishing residents who dared to question Celeste's decisions or suggest alternative approaches to neighborhood management. Mrs. Monroe has been systematically using her position to target residents who express concerns at meetings or who might threaten her control over HOA decisions, Mary explained, showing examples of residents who'd been hit with sudden violations and expensive fines immediately after voicing opinions that differed from Celeste's preferred policies. And in every single case, the recommended solution involved hiring companies that have documented financial relationships with HOA board members or their family members. But the most devastating evidence came from the video I'd recorded on the day my irrigation system was destroyed. Footage that told the whole story in vivid, undeniable detail. When Mary played that recording on the Community Sense projection screen, the room fell into darkness, except for the harsh light from the projector casting shadows on concerned faces. In the footage, Celeste stood before the excavator like a general commanding troops, her hand pointing down at the broken pipes, her face showing not the slightest hesitation or remorse about the destruction she was ordering. A small child in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is that lady breaking that water thing?" "Mommy." An elderly man in the front row raised a trembling hand to cover his mouth, whispering hoarsely, She's actually smiling while she does it." The slow-motion replay showed water exploding in all directions, pipes being crushed into fragments, and the sharp cracking sounds that pierced through the speakers like needles in everyone's ears. You could hear gasps of shock and angry murmurs throughout the room as people saw exactly what had happened and how Celeste had behaved during the destruction of my property. There she was, clearly visible and completely recognizable, directing the demolition of my legally installed water system while making false claims about community regulations and resource waste, all while showing no concern whatsoever for the financial damage she was causing or the legal rights she was violating. "This is your HOA president," Mary announced, as the video showed Celeste supervising the destruction with obvious satisfaction, illegally destroying a resident's private property and then attempting to force him to hire her preferred contractors to repair the damage that she personally ordered and supervised. The final nail in Celeste's coffin came from something I'd been saving for exactly this moment: audio recordings of my interactions with HOA representatives, including some very revealing phone conversations that showed the real motivations behind the harassment campaign I'd been enduring. During all those weeks of violation notices and intimidation tactics, I'd been carefully documenting everything, including some phone calls where Celeste had been remarkably candid about her strategies for dealing with problem residents and making it crystal clear that the violations and fines were retaliation rather than legitimate enforcement of reasonable community standards. When I played the audio of her discussing how to make life difficult enough that troublemakers either fall in line or move somewhere else, even her most loyal supporters couldn't defend her behavior anymore. Her own voice, captured in crystal clear digital audio, proved beyond any reasonable doubt that she'd been systematically abusing her position for personal gain and using HOA authority to punish anyone who dared to challenge her increasingly authoritarian rule. Celeste suddenly stood up with such force that her chair nearly toppled backward. "That's fake. That's artificial intelligence. You people are being manipulated," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation as she realized her carefully constructed empire was crumbling around her. She stepped quickly toward the projector, clearly intending to unplug the equipment and stop the presentation. But two residents, a retired doctor and a law student, immediately moved to block her path. "Not this time," the older man said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with difficult patients and impossible situations. "Nobody gets to silence this community anymore." The room erupted in genuine anger, but this time it was directed at the right target instead of at me for having the audacity to fight back against systematic abuse. Residents who'd been afraid to speak up before were now sharing their own stories of harassment, questionable fines, and pressure to hire specific contractors at inflated prices that seemed designed more to enrich certain businesses than to actually maintain or improve the community. The pattern was absolutely unmistakable once people started talking openly. Celeste had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, complete with a network of business relationships that systematically funneled community money into her friends' pockets, while keeping residents too intimidated and isolated to organize any effective opposition. It was corruption on a scale that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so destructive to the community she was supposed to serve and protect. The meeting concluded with a formal vote of no confidence in Celeste Monroe and the immediate suspension of her authority pending a complete investigation into HOA finances, contractor relationships, and enforcement practices by an independent third party. Rob Miller was unanimously appointed as interim administrator, with full authority to make necessary decisions with Mary Gardner, serving as community liaison, to ensure complete transparency in all future HOA operations and decision-making processes. It was a complete reversal of power that felt almost too good to be true after months of harassment and intimidation. But it was really happening right before my eyes. The woman who'd made everyone's life miserable for years was finally being held accountable for her actions. And the community was taking back control of their own neighborhood from someone who'd treated it like her personal thief for far too long. The transformation in our neighborhood over the following weeks was remarkable. With Celeste gone and Rob Miller providing interim leadership, the HOA suddenly became the kind of organization it was supposed to be all along: a group of neighbors working together to maintain and improve their community. One of Rob's first acts was to establish a transparent bidding process for all contractor work, which immediately resulted in dramatic cost savings and much better service quality. Wallace Thompson's Green Oasis Landscaping was blacklisted from ever working in the neighborhood again, and the new contractors we hired were both more competent and significantly less expensive. But the most important conversation we needed to have was about water service. And I'd been thinking carefully about how to handle that discussion. I could have used my ownership of the water rights to get revenge, to extract ridiculous fees, or to make demands that would have been just as unreasonable as anything Celeste had ever done. But that would have made me just another petty tyrant. And that wasn't what this community needed. Instead, I proposed something that I thought would benefit everyone while ensuring that nothing like Celeste's reign of terror could ever happen again. At the first official meeting of the new HOA board, I presented my terms for restoring water service. I was willing to sell my water rights back to the community at a fair market price, with the proceeds going into a reserve fund for genuine infrastructure improvements, rather than inflated contractor payments. In exchange, I wanted ironclad guarantees that HOA governance would remain transparent and accountable with regular financial audits, competitive bidding for all work, and clear appeal processes for any residents who felt they were being treated unfairly. Most importantly, I wanted assurance that no one would ever again be able to use HOA authority for personal gain or revenge. The negotiation process was refreshingly straightforward compared to the games and manipulation we'd all gotten used to under Celeste's leadership. Rob Miller brought his legal expertise to ensure that all the agreements were properly documented. Maria Garcia made sure that community input was incorporated into every decision. And I contributed my technical knowledge to help design a water management system that would be both efficient and sustainable. Within 2 weeks, we had a comprehensive agreement that satisfied everyone involved and provided a framework for how the community would operate going forward. The day we restored water service was like a neighborhood-wide celebration. I walked out to that same valve I'd shut off weeks earlier. But this time, I was surrounded by neighbors who were there to witness the symbolic restart of our community's fresh beginning. As I turned the valve and water pressure returned to the neighborhood, people actually cheered and applauded. Kids ran around checking faucets and sprinklers. Adults started planting garden projects they had been putting off. And everyone seemed to feel a sense of relief that the crisis was finally over, and we could get back to the business of being a real community. But I wasn't done yet. In my new role as the community's water systems consultant, I proposed an ambitious project that would make our neighborhood a model for sustainable resource management. Using my expertise in water systems and the reserve fund we had established with the sale of the water rights, we designed and built a comprehensive rainwater collection and graywater recycling system that would reduce our dependence on external water sources and lower everyone's utility bills. It was the kind of forward-thinking project that never could have happened under Celeste's leadership. But with genuine community cooperation, it became a source of pride for everyone involved. The final chapter of this story came a few months later when I was working in my garden, which was now greener and more beautiful than it had ever been. I happened to look up and see a familiar figure walking slowly past my house, looking tired and defeated. It was Celeste Monroe, apparently taking one last walk through the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. She stopped for a moment and stared at the new community sign that had been installed near the entrance. Greenwater Community. Sustainable. Transparent. Together. Below that, in smaller letters, it read, Water Management Consulting by Clark Hydro Solutions. She caught me watching her, and for a moment, our eyes met across the garden. I could see in her expression a mixture of anger, regret, and something that might have been grudging respect. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. But I think we both understood that this was how justice really works. Not through revenge or punishment, but through building something better than what came before. She turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner and out of our lives forever, while I went back to tending my garden in a community that had finally learned how to take care of itself. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the real victory wasn't in shutting off Celeste's water, or exposing her corruption, or even in getting her removed from power. The real victory was in proving that ordinary people can stand up to bullies and create something better when they work together with transparency, accountability, and genuine respect for each other. Sometimes you don't need to slap a Karen. You just need to turn off their water supply and wait for the truth to come flowing out. And in the end, justice tastes even sweeter when it's mixed with the sound of water flowing freely through a community that finally learned how to govern itself with dignity and fairness. QA Stories. Thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more.